Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're as excited about this afternoon as I am. This looks like a very exciting program. Let's start without ado for those of you who are on time. And I am pleased to introduce Lowell Anthony. He is currently at the University of Kentucky Markey Cancer Center. I see that he is a Vanderbilt alumni, medical school residency, and fellowship in hematology oncology, and now is the director of oncology. And Dr. Anthony is going to talk to us about the role of investigational drugs. When do they fit in your care? Lowell?
Thank you very much, Sue. It's a real pleasure to be back in the Crescent City and see some people that it's been at least 5 years since I've last remember them, and it's so wonderful to see people doing so well. The topic this afternoon that I've been assigned is how investigational care fits into your care. So a few disclaimers. I'm a clinical trialist, so I do clinical trials. Companies that I work with right now, Lexicon, Mation, and AbbVie, Stemcentrx. So how many people in the room have heard of the Moonshot program? So if anybody didn't hear about it, then you weren't here yesterday, I guess. Or you have a very short memory. So to quote an important aspect of what this group is attempting to do is the working group puts as one of the foremost goals to state that cancer clinical trials continue to be the gold standard by which new preventative treatment, supportive care, and other interventions are tested and compared with existing interventions. New clinical trial designs are emerging with the recognition that a single cancer type may consist of many different molecular subtypes, and that a given molecular alteration may drive many different types of cancer. At the same time, it is important that more patients have the opportunity to enroll in trials, and that's really what my talk today is about, to ensure that the results of trials are as broadly applicable as possible and that answers are obtained as quickly as possible. So if we look and just say how big of a project, how big of an effort is underway in oncology, the Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers Association, which is the professional association for pharma, stated that in their 2015 report that there are more than 800 different molecular entities or drugs that are vaccines that are under development in clinical trials to treat cancer. So this is a question that I always like to ask Dr. Woltering. Is he in the room? The question is, why do we do clinical trials? And this is a question that always gives the proverbial response, you know, why do you even have to ask? This is really a way that the only way that we have to test new concepts and develop a new standard of care. The questions that we focus on could be therapeutic and new agents that are coming to us, the Lutathera, specifically the Telotrestat, and where new agents have come from, the everolimus, the sunitinib, the lanreotide. These drugs came to us from clinical trials. There can be prevention trials, and people can say that prevention trials is really where the effort should be, more effort should be put rather than therapeutic trials if you're basically turning cancer into a disease that you only get several more months of survival in some cases. There can be screening trials, the low-dose CT scan to pick up lung cancer at an early stage in high-risk populations would be an example. And then diagnostic scanning. And what this has given us is the new gallium-68 dotatate agent that will become the next standard for us when we evaluate these patients, these neuroendocrine tumor patients with scintigraphy. So what's in it for the participants? The participants can contribute to the knowledge and the progress. There can be this altruistic component to it, but they also receive up-to-date care that is delivered by people who focus on these areas. If we look back a bit and see where have we come, what has the impact of clinical trials done for us, if we go back and look at the 1950 to 2000 cancer mortality rate in the U.S. in white males and white females, we can see that the survival U.S. mortality rate was pretty flat, not really much going on there. However, if we go into Sue's area, if we go into pediatric oncology, all of a sudden, you can kind of see in the 1970s, something happened in ALL. And this is really meant to be an approximate type curve. What was seen initially was at major pediatric centers, and then eventually it worked out into other countries. But even in medically undeveloped countries, we don't really see these kind of outcomes are not quite as good. So if we look at how pediatrics is operated, their percent people that participate in clinical trials, 85% in ALL, 53% osteosarcomas, neuroblastomas, 75%. So we can see that the kids are probably are oriented towards clinical trials, and their parents would certainly support their participation. But if we look at the adults, this really falls into a fairly small group of patients, and our goals is to move this closer to 10%, and that's what a major effort is underway right now. So whenever you think about clinical trials, we have to be thinking in the early stages of phase 1 trial, what's the question? Here it's really about toxicity or safety. If a drug has never been given to humans before, there's just a guess based on preclinical data what the initial starting dose should be. And at the end of a phase 1 trial, we have a recommended phase 2 dose. When it moves into phase 2, the question is efficacy. How good is it across a number of different tumor types? And now with predictive models, we don't necessarily have to expose people to agents that they may not benefit from. And this area of oncology was first really shown to make a difference in melanoma. There's no reason we should be testing drugs for certain mutations in the population that those mutations do not occur in. Phase 3 trials are the world of changing the standard. And whenever we talk about a phase 3 trial, it has to be a randomization. The randomization might be a 1-to-1 randomization. It might be a 2-to-1, such as in the AAA Lutathera trial, to encourage more participation if it's more likely, more than double the chance that you get a therapeutic agent. But if you don't have some sort of control arm, then the value then becomes questionable. And then the final stages would be post-approval, just to get experience in a larger group, would be phase 4. How are research participants protected in this? There are study standard procedures that are put into place. The IRB is one of those approval boards that is either can be local to the center or can be outside the center, that they have a contract with in providing such a review. And this is a board that really looks at the risk to the patient, studies a consent form, and there's really not a scientific, it's not really meant to be a scientific review. The IRBs include physicians, researchers, community leaders, other members of the community. Some trials require data and safety monitoring committees to be part of the assessment. And then this safety monitoring committee is an independent committee that's made up of statisticians, physicians, and sometimes patient advocates. So if we look at how clinical trials are relevant to neuroendocrine tumors, we can look at the diagnostic trials to identify disease sites more accurately, to interpret the signs and symptoms of cancer that is usually present, or at least we're attempting to detect early disease. Treatment trials, trials that evaluates the effectiveness, the Lutathera, telotrestat, the types of trials that might be done, vaccines, new drugs, new approaches to surgery, new approaches to radiation. Quality of life for supportive care trials. These would be focused on improving patient comfort, and I think the telotrestat would be in that group, that it's not a therapeutic trial, but it's a quality of life and improvement in that as the major endpoint. These types of studies may focus on nausea, emesis, diarrhea, depression, sleep disorders. I think we would all like to see one focused on malaise. Genetic studies. A lot of times these studies are piggybacked onto another clinical trial. These trials are specifically asked what's the genetic makeup influences and may be part of detection, diagnosis, or response to treatment. And usually these require blood or tissue samples. Where can I go to get information about clinical trials? Part of the Moonshot program was to make these kinds of data more accessible to physicians in practice, in patients. And what had happened in the clinicaltrials.gov website that NIH is responsible for, it's a fairly large group. It's international as well as national, but it's easy, if you don't have expertise, it's easy to get lost in such a huge database. So part of the Moonshot program was to bring it into the NCI level, where these are trials that are relevant strictly to cancer. So the website trials.cancer.gov is an initiative that has come out recently. The American Cancer Society, American Society of Clinical Oncology, pharmaceutical sponsors, these are just examples of where not meant to be exhaustive whatsoever. Who sponsors clinical trials? We can all say that it's probably best to have some independent sponsor, and that you could say that governments would be the best sponsor of where they have the infrastructure to provide the support in drug distribution, sometimes drug manufacturing, but collecting data and interpreting data. But it's really, our country is really not set up that way, where our agencies can really take the initiative when it comes to clinical trials, better for basic science and maybe some of the diagnostic, some of the screening type of clinical trials. Physicians can certainly sponsor clinical trials if they so wish. Medical institutions can do the same, certain foundations, volunteer groups, but overwhelmingly for drugs in early development and to change the standard of care if they get that far would be our pharmaceutical sponsors. It's those who have the agents and have the dollars then can promote that in such a way that they can get an approval process. But at the end of that approval process, you can say that there could be significant conflicts because the sponsor had a lot at risk and spun the data in a positive manner. To counteract that, the trials are done usually in association with a regulatory agency like the FDA, and the trials are intended to be fair and balanced. But when it comes to review and these trials get into the peer review system, it can be pretty brutal for anybody that tries to get a sponsor a drug trial in the New England Journal of Clinical Oncology or such. These trials are really taken apart and conflicts are looked at very carefully before they're published. Eligibility criteria. In order for a trial, for someone to enter in a trial, it's a two-part partnership, you might say. One part patient, one part sponsor. The patient has to accept the trial, the trial has to accept the patient. So just because someone wants to be on the trial doesn't necessarily mean they can get into the trial. We use things called eligibility criteria, inclusion, exclusion criteria that could differ from study to study. They may include age, gender, history, current health status, may require a particular type of malignancy or a particular stage. And trying to organize trials like this is what the sponsor is looking for, more of a uniform population. And there's also the eligibility criteria attempts to minimize a person's underlying condition becoming worse by participating in a trial. If you know a drug may have some cardiac toxicity or some kidney toxicity, you don't want to take patients who are having those issues on the front end. So the first thing is an informed consent. This is where the subject learns about what the important facts are about the trial. It's meant to be in about 6th grade language. And this is really meant to be a very detailed type of information to let the person understand what the purpose of the trial is, know what they're getting into. I'll tell people it's a little bit like being on a cruise ship. You've signed up for a program and you're going to be told pretty much what to do on what date, and you go along and don't ask too many questions. And that's really called a study calendar or study guide, and that will outline all the details of what tests and procedures are going to be done on which day. The informed consent will explain the possible risk and benefits. And then the consent form is a document that the subject will get a copy of to potentially read before they sign it, but they will have a written copy to take to another center. For instance, I've had the case where I've taken care of somebody who's on a clinical trial at another center, and I really need to look at their consent form to see whether my recommendations and things might be put in the context of what that clinical trial is all about. And then the informed consent continues throughout the study. The patient can withdraw informed consent at any time. The sponsor can withdraw consent. They can say, we've had enough, we're closing it down. Where the trial is conducted, they can be in the doctor's office itself, it can be in a cancer center, it can be in any other medical center, community hospitals, clinics, VA hospitals, military hospitals, and it may be conducted at 1 or 2 highly specialized centers versus diffuse locations globally. You know, it can be a national trial, could be a global trial. So the benefits of participating in clinical trials would be access to promising new approaches otherwise not available. And in the world of oncology, we talk about drugs that are approved for certain indications. If those indications are used outside of that, they're considered off-label. Off-label indications, if there's potential early data, could be part of a clinical trial. And in some cases, if there's early data, the patients are not eligible, they don't qualify for a clinical trial. Sometimes off-label use of these drugs otherwise is paid for by either insurance or other sources. So it's just, so if the agent's on the market, then there's one process. If the agent's not on the market, then either you go and have the trial, accept the limitations of the trial or not. Our whole aspects of putting somebody on a clinical trial is that our bias is that it's better than effective therapy, than the standard of therapy. And in my personal aspect, if I don't think it's better than effective therapy, or if I think I know the answer to it, and I know that the experimental arm is better than the control arm, I probably will not participate in it. I always ask the question, when I look at a clinical trial, would I personally want to enroll myself in it? And that's really the number one question that I ask. One of the real pluses is that once you go on a clinical trial, my attitude is if you're going to donate your time and effort, you need to be, it's like riding in the first class part of the airplane. You don't need to be waiting when you show up to register. You don't need to be in the masses of people registering that day. You need to be taken to the front of the line, getting labs drawn and all this other stuff. This is where clinical trial participants should be looked at as not only, you might say, heroes in some respects, but they should really be looked at as given priority, and that you're not just what in some institutions I've seen, you're one of them. Clinical trial patients are not one of them. Clinical trial patients are very special. How we evaluate them, how we treat them and stuff, I'm very sensitive to because the burden of things that we put on them certainly is more than what we see with normal standard of care. So the excitement of being on a clinical trial is you may be in a very early group to benefit from some new method, and that's their whole aspect, is to try and understand what is that likelihood. In a phase 1 trial, it's probably not a great likelihood. In phase 2 trial, possibly more of a greater, because now the dose has been defined and we know a little bit more about it. And then there's the altruistic. You just may help others. Possible risk. It's not everything's I don't want to say it's rosy on a clinical trial. New drug developments and procedures are not always better than standard of care. That's why it's called a clinical trial. Unexpected side effects that possibly could be worse than the standard of care could occur. Participants may not choose which treatment when they're randomized. And then the cost always have to be addressed. What's the insurance going to pay for, not pay for? What kind of risk would I be taking as a participant? And then clearly there's going to be more tests, there's going to be more visits, everything's going to be more because we're on the pathway to discovery, finding out new things. So who do we ask to pay for clinical trials? Where are the costs? Health insurance, managed care providers may not cover all aspects, and we attempt to understand this early on. And if they don't, then the sponsor or some other way of getting the trial paid for may be an option. So health plans specifically have to be looked at and see what level they're willing to support. I've seen cases where it's actually cheaper and better if a health plan will encourage a patient to be on clinical trials, but for some reason it's not one of these logical kind of things. They will come out and say no. Trials may have to be sponsored by a specific organization to be judged medically necessary by a health plan. So that may be if NCI is not backed it, or if it's not part of some more credible group, then it's not supported. It may not be significantly more expensive than treatments that the health plan considers standard, but that's really not necessarily, they don't look at necessarily the cost per se. So the health care plans are highly individual how they do, but in general I see very little pushback from the standard of care procedures that we ask our health care plans to provide. And then the things that are not part of that, usually the sponsor will. So the cost to the individual subject really should not be that burdensome. What we look at is the subject gets free drug, and in return they donate their time. So that's sort of the bottom line. If for trials that actually have the patient pay for the drug, that would probably not be a trial you'd want to seriously consider participating in. That's my personal bias. Facility and medical staff might have to meet the plan's qualifications for conducting certain procedures, and that would get into organ transplant, for instance. Questions to ask before entering a study: why is the study being done? What's the specific question or hypothesis being tested? What are the early data that may be available to us? Who's sponsoring the trial? Is the study actively accruing, or when will it start accruing? And where is the study being conducted? What's the track record of the investigators and the study personnel? How will the study be monitored? What are the endpoints? How long will the study be open? When will the results be disseminated? What are the possible short-term, long-term benefits? What are the short-term, long-term risks, such as side effects? What are other treatment options? How do the possible risks and benefits of the trial compare with those of other options? What kinds of treatment, medical tests, or procedures will the participants undergo during the study? How often will the treatments, tests, or procedures occur? Will treatments, tests, procedures be painful? If so, how will the pain be controlled? How do the tests of the study compare with what people might receive outside the study? Will participants be able to take their regular medications, and are there medications that should be avoided? Where will the participants receive their medical care? Inpatient or in the outpatient clinic? Who will be in charge of participants' care? Will they be able to see their own doctors while participating in a clinical trial? How long will the participants need to stay in the study? And will there be follow-up visits after the study? What's the impact of the study on one's daily life? Is the support available for participants and their families? Can potential participants talk with subjects that are already enrolled in the trial? Will participants have to pay for any treatment, test, or other charges? If so, what will the approximate charges be? What is health insurance likely to cover? Who can help answer questions from the insurance company or health plans? So what happens when a trial is over? Well, the data is collected, carefully analyzed, and then before making decisions about the meaning and findings in further testing, then the group that's been assigned to evaluate this will publish, put out their findings. After a phase 1 or 2 trial, the researchers will decide whether to move on or not. Is this an effective therapy? Is it a safe therapy? Do we know what doses are the best to go forward with? When a phase 3 trial is completed, the researchers look at the data and decide whether the results have any medical importance or not. And the results should be, and often are, published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So what should happen to get us off this 5% number? Well, increasing clinical trial funding would be one item that's been identified. Removing barriers or participation. I think this is part of the Moonshot program. If we can get information out to people, let them know where these clinical trials are being performed, then this will be helpful because we know it's best to have patients closer to their home. Nationwide public and private insurance coverage of clinical trials would be another way. Full reimbursement to oncology practice for the cost of participation. Measures to increase the diversity in clinical trial. So to summarize the whole program, what is the role of investigational drugs? Where do they fit into your care? So the answer would be when standard of care options are limited or maybe less appealing than investigational approaches. And we see a lot of things on television. Immunology potentially is the up-and-coming wave of the future in oncology. And it's possible getting in on a clinical trial with an antibody drug that shows benefit in a resistant population, usually that's how drugs are usually developed, and moving it forward into early first-line settings might be more appealing than other forms of standard of care. So when an agent, a new class of agents, and particularly today the immune checkpoint inhibitors, if you had an opportunity to participate in this type of trial because of the safety data, because of the activity that's been seen in a variety of different cancers, this might be something that someone might risk saying standard care options are more toxic, standard care options are not curative, and I'm willing to take my chances to delay standard care options before I'll go on to a clinical trial, and that might be something that needs to be addressed early on. So I would like to conclude and say that we'll be having a NCAN Net Patient Conference on April the 22nd of next year in Lexington at this hotel at the Griffin Gate. This is occurring during racing season in Lexington. Those of you who are familiar with the bluegrass state, there are really 3 things that we're really focused on. One's bourbon, another one's basketball, and the other one are beast of burdens or racing. I have to get 3 B's in there, right? So this weekend is the 3rd weekend in the month where Keeneland will be racing, and to be able to have a meeting in this hotel is absolutely phenomenal because all the racing people are in town. So it will be quite an event to participate. So this is a interesting place. So I've been really nervous while I've been up here. I don't know if you could tell that, but I'm pretty nervous. Mark Twain made the statement, there's 2 kinds of speakers, And since I'm telling you I'm really nervous, then you know I'm not the other kind. So.